Okay, I'm going to take you through some of the improvements about to be released in version 0.8.9. We're going to go ahead and take this up from 0.84 to 0.89, and then after any little bug fixes we find, then this will basically become version 0.9. So first is the set landmarks. When we click these and we get this little plane here, one thing that I was noticing was that the midline follows the midline, but for some reason the incisal edge also was changing the orientation of the midline, and that it's subtle and it's not the main driver of what determines the midline, but this should not affect it at all. The incisal edge position should only affect the basic fit of the plane to the teeth. So I corrected that in the next version. And then the big thing here is in how the articulator is oriented, and also in the coordinate system. If you notice here that the x-axis is pointing forward, that was an arbitrary decision I made a few years ago, and now in the new version, we've changed that to match to match a big portion of other softwares. There's no convention out there, but we at least wanted to pick one of the main conventions, so we aligned ourselves with the DICOM format. Okay, so we've got improvement in the occlusal plane marking and the coordinate system change, and then now we're going to take a deep dive into the articulator. So changing the pin worked fine before, but you couldn't really play with your articulator values. Like, you could change them, accept them, and then do your animation to see how that affected. I'll show you in the new version how you can dynamically alter your articulator settings and view the resulting changes live. Alright, under the hood here, all these objects are just decorations for a Blender armature. Okay, that's an animation data structure that allows typically for the rigging and animation of characters, so legs and bones and arms and things. And so some elements of representing a dental articulator weren't well captured here. I was driving two condyles down each path and then determining the rotation in the horizontal plane based on how these two condyles were pointing at each other. So progressive side shift was actually ignored, because if you think about these two angled condylar tracks coming together, that would essentially cause the condyles to be compressed, and so in the newer version that is better taken care of, and I'll show that. The other thing is all the math in the new version has been taken internally. So for this articulator and constraint system, there's actually a little feedback loop. So you can see here that Blender is kind of complaining, okay, you want the right condyle to look at the left condyle, and then the left condyle to look back at the right condyle to determine where the jaw should be positioned. Okay, so if you've ever noticed, if you watch zoom in here and we watch this incisal guide pin, as it moves, it kind of stutters down the protrusion. Now that only happens when the user is adjusting this live, but it's always bothered me. So if I press play, it goes smoothly straight down the protrusion. But then you run into trouble with things like if the user was in an excursion and said, oh, I don't have enough clearance, and they changed the pin. Oh, and I paused Blender by clicking in the and they changed the pin setting. Sometimes it wouldn't bring it all the way back to 0, because it's like one iteration of the loop wasn't happening. So if they did this and then they rewound, depending on which way the articulator was, it might not have each condyle look back at each other. And here you can see, even though we're back at the resting position, the pin is off here, partly in a lateral excursion. So the chances of that ever causing a problem are very low. Like, it'd be kind of a strange scenario of user actions to end up there. But it always bothered me. A, the stuttering. I thought the stuttering was highly annoying. And two, there were like very fringe cases where you could end up with the lower jaw in a position that just didn't make sense. Okay, enough about this. Let me pull up the new version and show you all the good stuff. Okay, so we're back. Now we're in version 0.8.9, and the improvements start as early as the landmark step, which two things happening now. One is that the incisal edge has no control over the midline, and two is that you have a nice sagittal plane to help you visualize that you've got this oriented correctly. So if it helps to know, it's taking the bisector between the left and right molar. So that's why it's pretty important to mark equivalent points. So if you're missing a molar, it's better to make sure you're marking two equivalent premolars. So now we've got kind of a live view of the plane, so you can make sure you're getting as close to appropriately aligned as possible. So that was a small little fix that I think will go a long way. Okay, and now the articulator will look just a little bit different, and it's made to represent more accurately what's actually happening. The simulation has always been Archon with the condyles on the lower element, but the decoration, just the 3D rendering down here, had a guide pin and stuff that was actually non-Archon. So I got rid of that and I put the pin on the bottom element. I also moved the incisal guide table up here, which is more consistent with how Archon articulators sometimes are. So we've still got the same, you can slide the timeline here and preview the animation. We can still change the pin, but let me hide a few things and show you a few slight enhancements on that are some enhancements to the mechanics of this articulator. If we look at this from above, when we are doing a right working movement, as I said before, if this is translating down kind of a straight path, the distance between the condyles should be maintained. So in the past, I was actually not letting the working condyle move at all, and then calculating rotation here. So that progressive side shift that should be happening as you slide down this track was not. And now if we look closely, we can see that it is. So it's very subtle because it's, at very small angles, this straight line is a pretty good approximation of an arc. But now we are calculating that side shift that's happening. The second improvement in the simulation is that with the armature, we were doing a simple linear raycast to find the collision with the guide table. And that's fine for small angles, but once you get to steeper angles, it's not really a straight raycast. It should have been a curved or an intersection of a circle with this plane to actually derotate around the new rotational axis. And so at larger incisal angles, the collisions that are happening on the guide table are now perfect. So under the hood, the math is better, and also the math is all internal. So there's no constraints, there's no armature. For that reason, it's quite a bit smoother when you are previewing live. It's also a tiny bit faster when you're calculating the surfaces in the background. Okay, and then here, all that is fine and well, and I would say that the impact that's going to have on your occlusal surfaces is fairly minor. But what this really allows us to do is we can now drive our articulator. Okay, we can drive down here, and then we can change things while we're in these manipulated positions. So here I'm setting my guidance. I might also drive the protrusion all the way forward and then decrease my condyle length, thereby decreasing the overall distance that the simulation is going to happen on. So here I've kind of set my range of motion. Then I can just drive one or the other condyle, and I can adjust my canine guidance. Okay, and then one thing to note is that it's going to rebuild your animation after you change your settings. So this live preview here helps you set the values, but it's going to reset to the 0 position after you do that. Another really cool thing is, let me put all the decoration back on, is let's say we've protruded down here. Okay, we can now kind of start to see the effect that the condyle angle has on the posterior disclusion. Okay, and then we can also see that when we rotate that angle down, we're actually pulling the lower jaw back up the ramp a little bit. And so who knew that if you increase your condyle angle, you actually have to increase your incisal guidance to get the same amount of disclusion. And so all of a sudden this becomes a really cool visualization tool and probably a fantastic teaching tool. So I'm really proud of this. It's been on the to-do list for a while, but it's kind of a major reworking to redo all this math, how we're going to write the keyframes to the animation system, and make sure that you can't get into any trouble in terms of creating a system that it's going to cause trouble if not appropriately managed through all the data. So it was a big undertaking. It took me an extra 24 hours than I was expecting, but here we are. Another cool thing, we can check our clearance, right? So we'll set this at 200 microns. I'll make the top jaw translucent. I'll hide this plane, and then when you're playing with your articulator values, you essentially have live occlusion. So you can adjust this to your heart's content. And it's calculating the live occlusal marks while screen recording is a little bit computer intensive, but it's still just a tiny bit laggy, but it's totally workable. So I'm super pleased with that too. Okay, thank you for watching. Those are the updates. That was a kind of a deep dive. I'll obviously have a more promotional style video for people to watch. And that's all I've got.